Welcome to a couple of bunkies.
Okay, this is part 3 of the 3-part series where we make the accent wall and shoe and coat rack. And in this video, I'm going to be making the coat rack. But first, we're going to go through the design and drawing process. I do all of my drawing in a CAD software called ViaCAD. We live stream all of our design process, so please check out our channels live to see some of the projects that we've been drawing. So first we're putting out the surface area that's going to be covered on the wall. The back is going to be made of 2 sections. One lower area to hold heavy coats, and the upper area to hold keys and hats. And with this, I need to work out a profile for the corbels. This project is actually heavily inspired by a project that I had made in the past. I basically made this project in 2005 with a 4-foot board. Now after this, I had some issues drawing up the corbels. Eventually I realized that I had made some corbels not too long ago. I made some designs for a bar that we were planning to make. And they had a woodland animal theme that I really liked. So I went ahead and imported the profile of that corbel. All I really need to do is stretch it in order to conform with the size of the corbel I need this time, to make room for the keys and the coats. I also didn't want to have a massive shelf over top of everything, so I needed a longer height than width of the corbel. So I need to tweak the original corbel. Now the shelf is going to be around 6 feet off the ground, and one of my wife's suggestions is to have just a slight angle on the shelf so that she can still see some of the things on top of that shelf. And we wanted 3 of these corbels to be on the project, 1 on each outside and 1 in the middle. I also need to fix some kind of barrier so stuff doesn't roll off of the shelf. I drew a quick little design and we'll see what I come up with when it comes down to using the router table. And I finished drawing the shelf that's going to be sitting on top of the corbels. And I tried to incorporate roundovers on all of my boards. I'm not a big fan of sharp edges. Now that I've drawn the front view, I can go ahead and start adding pegs for the coat rack and the key racks. I'm attempting to use the linear duplication tool in order to achieve an effect. Now I want to use 2 different sizes of shaker style pegs for all of the hooks and everything for this project. I really wanted to get inventive for it, but we were kind of on a time crunch. The beauty of this program is that I can print out all of my projects to scale, so I can basically make a template and find out exactly where each of these holes are. Now in hindsight, I should have had at least another 4 inches between the coat rack and the key rack around the top, because we ended up using the key racks also for hats, and they hang down quite a bit. The bar that I had designed earlier had these really beautiful animal motifs on them, with the animal paw print, a silhouette of the animal, and a little bit of grass. All of this I found with a free trial of easel. Now easel is actually completely free and does a heck of a lot of lifting. You can basically design projects and generate the G-code in order to cut it out with a CNC. If you're interested in looking at it in action, I believe I used it when making the Kleenex box holders. I believe it might have been our second or third video. So right now I'm just separating the animals and the design from the old corbels. And I'm going to go ahead and import the profile of the corbels that we're now using and make 3 laser engravable designs for each of these animals: the bear, the rabbit, and the deer. Now each corbel has 2 sides, and I don't want to make the mistake of having 2 of the same side cut out. So I'm going to have to mirror the image so that all together we end up having 6 images in order to laser engrave onto the corbels. And I end up realizing that I must have never finished the rabbit prints. So I go ahead and hand draw some of the prints. And I do my best to incorporate it into the rabbit motif. Now initially I was going to be trying to put these into the Carve-Right CNC, but the CNC is currently down, so I'm going to go ahead and use the Monport laser. That seems to be the most reliable piece of machinery that I have right now. But I can go ahead and show you the process in order to create the corbels inside of a CNC CAD. So I'm going to have to separate each of these images and put them into their own file so I can cut them out with the laser engraver. I'm basically limited to about what you can fit on a sheet of paper. But as I've said in the past, as long as you know your limitations, you can design things in order to exceed those limitations. Now, after adding the red line at 255 to cut out the project, I can use that same file in order to line up all of the other corbels. This makes it extraordinarily easy in order to switch out projects, so I don't have to find a new center. Now, my laser engraver actually doesn't have a height adjustment either. Therefore, I had to go ahead and resaw some material to about 1/2 inch that I'm going to have to glue back together later. We have an affiliate link with Monport Laser, where you can get a discount on all of Monport's machines. Use the link below and use the promo code Timothy10 at checkout. I start off with the laser engraver using the raster engrave setting. That does blacks and grayscales. Then I use the vector cut setting in order to cut out the profile of each of these corbels. The laser engraver won't cut the entire 1/2 inch of material, but it will give me a guide that I can go over with the bandsaw. After the laser engraver has done its thing, I take it over to the bandsaw and cut each individual piece out. Now I glue all of the corbels together. I kept the deer designs, the bear designs, and the rabbit designs all together. After everything was glued, I went ahead and sandwiched them between 2 boards and then clamped them together. This made it nice so I didn't have to use multiple clamps on these small projects. Now that the glue had time to cure, I removed these shelf brackets, and now I can go ahead and start working on the rest of the cherry boards in order to make this shelf. Now I knew right away I would have to join two pieces of wood together in order to make the shelf itself. So that would have taken an extra 4 or 5 hours to cure the glue after joining. So I joined those two pieces of board together first. So I took two boards about the right size. Then I ripped one to around 3 inches. Then I used the table saw to give me a flat edge in order to join both pieces of lumber together with. I then applied glue and then I clamped it together and set it in the other room in order to cure overnight. So I had a board that I had all cut up for another project that I decided to go ahead and use on this one instead, since it was already planed and everything was all together. So I went ahead and cut the 4 face boards, and it still was a little short, so I had to get another board out in order to cut it to the right size. The long board that I had cut out earlier is a little thick, so I'm going to go ahead and use the table saw in order to resaw this piece to a thinner dimension. This is going to be used as a rail over the top, so it's not entirely structural. And I run all of the boards that I'd cut just recently through the thickness planer. This helps maintain a consistent thickness to all of my boards. Now I'm going to take all of the boards over to the table saw, and using my miter gauge, I go ahead and square up all of the ends of the boards. After squaring up all of the ends of the boards, I use the router table in order to round over all of the edges of the boards. Now earlier I talked about the little fence that went across the top of the board so items wouldn't slip off of the shelf. I'm going to do my best with the router table to see if I can make something decorative and practical for this coat rack. I start off making lines on the board with a 3/8 roundover bit. I flip the project over and run it on the other side and adjust my fence about 1 inch, and then run it through on both sides one more time. The end design looks like a pawn. Now I'm going to go ahead and start sanding and preparing the shelf supports. I do this with the belt sander and the oscillating sander. And lastly, I take it over to the router table and round over the front face, and I take a finishing sander to all of the shelf supports and the shelf fence to remove any burn marks left over from the router table and the blades. And I finished the shelf fence with a Dremel and hand sanding. I still wasn't happy with that shelf as it was, so I went ahead and decided to create this little 30-degree angle on the ends of it. And I did this by taking it over to the bandsaw in order to cut the ends. And of course I had to sand it down afterwards, getting rid of all of the sharp edges. Now I can do a dry fit. Now I wasn't a big fan of this large gap on the ends in the middle of the shelf. So I decided to go ahead and do a groove into the boards to inlay the shelf supports. I take the boards to the table saw and use the miter gauge to make a shallow groove so the shelf supports can set in. They will also give more surface area for a glue up later. Now I can glue and clamp all of the parts together for the back of the shelf. I still need to go ahead and make some changes in the top shelf. I move on to the top of the shelf. With the pre-glued board, I run it through the planer. I measure the dimensions of the board and use a square and a round cap to trace lines in the top of the shelf so I can go over everything with a jigsaw. Then I use a finishing sander in order to remove any of the burn marks left over from the saw. Then I set up the router table to round over the front of the boards. And I sand it over one more time after that to remove any cut marks. Now I need to make a small dado in the back of this board because it needs to overlap the accent wall. I cut this out with the table saw. Now I can glue and screw the shelf together. I countersink the holes and glue and screw, and then I fill the holes with a wooden dowel. Then I use a Japanese saw in order to cut the dowel rods flush with the face of the shelf. Now I can add the fence the same way I had added the shelf, gluing and screwing everything together. Now I coat the project with 4 coats of clear polyurethane, with sanding in about 4 hours between coats. We ended up using shaker style pegs, and we wanted to put a coat of blue paint on them. So I went ahead and made a small jig with holes that would fit the dowels of the shaker style pens and painted each one. I printed out a 1-to-1 template of the hole pattern in order to drill all of the holes precisely where they need to be. Whenever I do repetitive, precise work like this, I always like to make a wooden template so I don't make as many mistakes. And it's always a good idea to put a little piece of tape over the area that you're drilling so you can have a usable hole for your project without having to do any extra sanding or work. Now I left a handful of the pegs out of the shelf so I can use the holes to drill into the studs and hide them with the pegs later. And there it is, all 3 parts of the project together. And the coat rack and shelf turned out absolutely perfect. I hope you enjoyed this content. Please like and subscribe.